When I woke, it felt like being dredged up from the bottom of a cold ocean. Cryosleep was supposed to make the transition seamless, but the ache in my joints and the metallic taste in my mouth told me otherwise. I lay still, staring at the translucent lid of my pod, blinking against the soft white light spilling through the edges. For a moment, I wasn't on the horizon arc. I was home, standing on a cracked concrete balcony under the yellow haze of Earth's poisoned sky. My chest tightened at the memory. That place was gone, and I was here, in the middle of nowhere. The lid opened, releasing a burst of air. I swung my legs out slowly, the chilled floor pressing against my bare feet. Around me, rows of identical pods stood in silent ranks, their curved surfaces reflecting the harsh fluorescence overhead. Of the 10,000 colonists aboard, only a handful of crew members were awake at any given time. The rest, suspended in their engineered slumber, wouldn't stir until we reached Cythera in another 70 years. Across the chamber, Tyler Kendrick, our resident technician, waved at me from his console. His brown hair was messy, sticking out in odd directions, and he was already nursing a thermos of coffee. I didn't need to ask where he got it. He probably rigged the dispenser again, bypassing the rotation's caffeine restrictions. "Welcome back, Lieutenant," he called, his voice carrying a practiced cheer that was more for himself than anyone else. "How's the future looking?" "Cold," I muttered, flexing my hands to get the blood moving. What did I miss? Nothing exciting, just the usual. No signals, no anomalies, and no surprise alien invasions. He grinned, but the punchline felt like it hung in the air longer than it should have. I nodded and made my way to the lockers, brushing past Tyler's setup of tools and maintenance logs. The smell of lubricants and soldering metal clung to the air, faint but constant, a reminder of how much work it took to keep this place running. My locker clicked open to reveal a neatly folded uniform, a pair of boots, and my personal tablet. I ran a hand over the uniform, smoothing out non-existent wrinkles, and thought about Earth again. My brother Dylan had been the hardest person to leave behind. He was 16 when I last saw him, standing at the edge of the spaceport terminal, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, forcing a grin. "Don't forget me, okay?" he'd said, half joking, trying to make it easier for both of us. "As if I ever could," I'd replied, smiling back. But now, years into this journey, the memory felt like something from another lifetime. Once dressed, I checked the manifest on my tablet. It displayed the status of the colonists, all accounted for. Their pods were marked green, each entry listing vitals, sleep cycles, and allocation numbers. I scrolled through the list out of habit, scanning for any anomalies, when something caught my attention. There were 5 names I didn't recognize. I paused, scrolling back. "Tyler, did we take on any new passengers before departure?" Tyler looked up from his screen, his smile fading. "Not that I know of. Why?" "There are 5 names here that aren't on my pre-sleep roster." He frowned, setting down his thermos and crossing the room to look over my shoulder. "Could be a clerical error. The database gets weird sometimes when we rotate out of cryo." "I don't think so. They're listed as active passengers, but I don't remember signing off on them." Tyler scratched the back of his head. "You should check with Vigil. It's probably nothing. Maybe backup crew? Sometimes they move people around after initial assignments." He tried to sound casual, but there was an edge of curiosity in his voice. The mention of Vigil, the ship's central AI, made my stomach tighten. I didn't like relying on it more than necessary. It was too efficient, too absolute in its logic, and always a little too slow when you wanted answers fast. Still, Tyler was right. The AI would have the records. I made my way to the command deck, the hallway stretching in long, claustrophobic lines of white and grey. The ship was designed for function, not comfort. Every surface was smooth and featureless, broken only by the occasional utility panel or access hatch. The recycled air was dry, carrying a faint smell of chemicals from the scrubbers. The command console came to life as I approached, the soft green glow of Vigil's interface rippling across the screen. "Lieutenant Vickers," it greeted in its standard, toneless voice. "Welcome to active duty. How may I assist you?" "I need to verify the cryo manifest," I said, typing in the relevant parameters, specifically the last 5 names added to the roster. The AI processed my request in silence. I crossed my arms, my focus drifting to the viewport at the far end of the deck. Through the thick, reinforced glass, the void stretched infinitely, a canvas of black broken only by pinpricks of distant stars. It was beautiful, in a way that made you feel small, insignificant. "The manifest is accurate," Vigil said, breaking the silence. "The listed individuals have been aboard since launch. There are no discrepancies." I frowned. "That's impossible. I've reviewed the roster myself. I'd remember these names." "Records indicate your approval during pre-launch protocols," the AI replied. "Shall I retrieve the authorization logs?" "Yes," I said, a knot forming in my chest. Something wasn't adding up. As Vigil retrieved the logs, I stared at the names on my tablet. Jacob Elson, Christopher Barrett, Quentin Harcourt, Wyatt Klein, and Isaac Cordell. 5 strangers, 5 ghosts as far as I was concerned. And yet, according to the ship's systems, they belonged here. Tyler appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "What did Vigil say?" "It says they've been here since launch, but I don't buy it." Tyler chuckled nervously. "Well, unless they've been hiding in the vents this whole time, I don't see how—" "Lieutenant Vickers," Vigil interrupted. "Authorization logs confirm your approval of the listed individuals. The logs are time-stamped and verified." I stared at the screen. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the chaos of pre-launch, when last-minute adjustments and administrative rushes blurred into a single, overwhelming memory. Still, it didn't make sense. How could I have signed off on someone I didn't remember? "I'll look into it," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Let me know if you need help," he said, heading back to his station. I found them during my second patrol. 5 people, standing in the observation lounge, their backs to the viewport, watching me with unnerving stillness as I entered. I stopped short, the air feeling heavier in my chest. Their posture, their unblinking attention, the synchronized way they all turned to face me at once. It was unsettling. There wasn't a shred of casual movement among them. No fidgeting, no adjusting of stances, not even a glance exchanged between them as I stepped into the room. It was as if they'd been waiting. One of them, a man with closely cropped salt and pepper hair and a face that might have belonged to someone in their late 40s, smiled. "Lieutenant Vickers," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, and oddly pleasant. "It's good to finally meet you." I didn't recognize him, or any of them. They all looked ordinary, which somehow made them stranger. No scars or blemishes, no asymmetry, just 5 faces that seemed vaguely familiar, as if I'd seen them in passing and forgotten the details. My hand tightened around the tablet in my grip. "You're the new passengers," I said, keeping my tone steady, professional. "I don't remember seeing you before." "That's understandable," he replied, still smiling. "We've been in cryostasis. It's difficult to recall everyone during pre-launch chaos, isn't it?" Behind him, a taller man with deep-set eyes and thick eyebrows nodded, his expression perfectly neutral. 2 others, a wiry man with angular features and long limbs, and a stockier one with a bald head, watched me without a word. The last one, a lean, sharp-featured man with dark hair, simply tilted his head slightly. "Is there something we can help you with, Lieutenant?" the first man asked. He gestured to the room with an air of practiced politeness. "We were just acquainting ourselves with the lounge." The lounge itself was as featureless as the rest of the ship, a long, rectangular room with reinforced walls and bolted furniture. A table, some chairs, and the viewport offering a static view of the endless black outside. It wasn't exactly a social hotspot. "Acquaint yourselves, sure," I said, my voice firmer now. "But you'll need to clear your schedules for a debrief. We'll need to go over protocols and system regulations." His smile remained unchanged. Of course. Whatever you need. There was something too smooth about the exchange, too rehearsed. I glanced at the others again. None of them were doing anything overtly wrong, but the way they stood there, motionless and perfectly spaced, like chess pieces on a board, put me on edge. My gut told me something was wrong, something more than just their strange timing. I left without saying anything else, my boots tapping against the metal floor with a rhythm that suddenly felt too loud. When I reached the corridor, I keyed my comm. "Brandon, where are you?" "Mid-level security sweep, why?" "We need to talk." It took me 5 minutes to reach him, long enough to run the encounter over in my head half a dozen times. When I found him near the maintenance lifts, his face already showed that familiar mix of irritation and resignation he reserved for conversations with me that started like this. "What now?" he asked, one hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Brandon always looked like he was ready to deal with trouble. Square shoulders, buzz cut, jaw clenched like he was chewing through steel. I gave him the rundown of what I'd seen. His reaction was exactly what I expected. "You're overthinking it," he said, folding his arms. "They're colonists, just like the rest of us. Maybe they're weird. So what? You've been asleep for years, memory gets hazy." "I'm telling you, something doesn't add up," I shot back. "They don't act like normal passengers. They don't talk like them either." "What do you want me to do? Throw them in the brig?" He snorted, the sound clipped and humorless. "Look, they're listed on the manifest. They've got no weapons, no records of misconduct, and no obvious violations. If you've got more than bad vibes, let me know." I clenched my jaw but didn't press further. Brandon was pragmatic to a fault. Unless someone waved a weapon in his face or outright admitted to sabotage, he wasn't going to lose sleep over them. I didn't blame him, but it didn't sit right with me either. Something about those 5 strangers made my skin crawl, and I couldn't let it go. The first malfunction hit the next morning. Tyler called me to the hydroponics bay, where water was spilling across the floor in sluggish streams, pooling around the base of the grow racks. I arrived to find him crouched near the pumps, his sleeves rolled up. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is," I said. "Depends what you think it is," he replied, tapping at the console. "Systems flagged it as a routine pressure surge, but that doesn't explain why the override protocols didn't kick in. I had to shut it down manually. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to throw off our food supply projections." I crouched beside him, examining the pumps. Everything looked fine. No signs of tampering, no obvious mechanical failure, and yet the error report nagged at me. "This happened before?" I asked. "Not like this," Tyler said. "Once in a while we get small fluctuations, but this..." He gestured to the water. "This shouldn't happen." I stood up, my jaw tightening. It was probably nothing, just a coincidence, just a minor hiccup in a system designed to last for centuries. But the timing, the way it came right after those strangers appeared. My mind replayed the interaction in the observation lounge, their overly polite responses, the unsettling stillness in their posture. It wasn't just that they were out of place, it was how deliberately they seemed to blend into the background, as if being forgettable was part of their purpose. I tapped a command into my tablet, pulling up a diagnostic sweep of the ship's access logs. If they'd been wandering where they shouldn't, the system should have flagged it. Nothing unusual popped up. No unauthorized entries, no deviations from standard protocols. It was like they didn't exist outside of the manifest. As I exited the hydroponics bay, I caught myself walking faster than normal, my boots striking the floor in sharp steps. I told myself it was to keep ahead of my rising irritation. That's when the alert pinged in my ear. An anomaly in auxiliary maintenance, something about a manual override flagged by Vigil. I found 2 of them in the auxiliary maintenance bay. It wasn't a place colonists or passengers should have been able to access without clearance. The door to the bay opened at my override code, and there they were, Salt and Pepper and the wiry man, standing by the exposed innards of a system control panel. The wiry one leaned in close, his hands hovering just shy of the open wiring, as though he could touch the circuitry without actually making contact. Salt and Pepper stood a step behind, hands clasped behind his back, watching with the calm patience of a teacher observing a student. "You're not supposed to be here," I said sharply, stepping inside. My voice echoed off the metal walls, too loud for the confined space. Salt and Pepper turned to me, his expression unbothered. "Ah, Lieutenant Vickers," he said smoothly, as if we were meeting at a scheduled briefing. "I hope we didn't cause alarm." "This area is restricted," I said, narrowing my eyes at the open panel. "How did you get in?" The wiry man straightened, his face serene, almost placid. "The door wasn't secured," he said, his tone light but eerily devoid of any defensiveness. "We were curious about the systems. A ship like this must be fascinating to maintain." I stepped closer, glancing down at the panel. Nothing looked obviously tampered with, but the fact they were even near it set my teeth on edge. "Curiosity isn't an excuse," I said, keeping my voice firm. "Passengers have no access to maintenance areas. Return to the common spaces now." Salt and Pepper gave a small nod as though I'd made a reasonable request. "Of course, Lieutenant, we didn't mean to overstep." The wiry man hesitated, his eyes resting on the panel for a moment longer before he followed the other out. Their footsteps were unnaturally quiet against the grated floor, and they didn't exchange a single word as they left. I waited until the door closed behind them, then crouched by the panel, running my fingers lightly over the wiring and connections. Everything seemed intact, but my pulse didn't slow. I tapped my comlink. "Tyler, I need you to check something out." "Problem?" His voice carried a faint edge of worry. "Maybe," I said, standing and staring at the door they'd exited through. "Or maybe just more questions I don't like the answers to." The logs didn't make sense. Tyler sat beside me in the command deck, scrolling through a dense matrix of system reports on his tablet. I leaned forward, staring at the console screen in front of me, trying to find a pattern in the anomalies that had cropped up since those 5 strangers woke up, or more accurately, since they appeared. Hydroponics failure, door malfunctions, environmental systems hiccups that temporarily increased CO2 levels on one deck. None of the issues were catastrophic, but all of them were out of line with the Ark's carefully calibrated systems. "It's not hardware," Tyler muttered, tapping the screen to highlight a timeline. "Look here, the glitches didn't start until 3 days ago, and they're spread out across systems that don't overlap, like someone's testing the limits." "Testing for what?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. My boots pressed firmly against the floor, grounding me against the rising sense of unease. "Hell if I know," he replied, scrubbing a hand through his already messy hair. "But it's deliberate. You don't get this kind of pattern by accident." I nodded slowly. "Run a diagnostic on the primary control algorithms. If someone's been poking around where they shouldn't, I want to know." He glanced at me. "You think it's them, don't you?" "They're not passengers," I said flatly. "Not real ones anyway. I don't know what they are, but they're not supposed to be here." "I'll see what I can dig up." I stood and left the command deck, making my way down to the cryo bay. The air was cooler here, the recycled oxygen taking on a faint chill as it passed through the massive array of dormant colonists. I moved between the rows of pods, each one illuminated by a steady green light that marked its occupant as stable. 10,000 people, frozen in quiet, peaceful stasis, unaware of the strangeness unfolding around them. My steps slowed as I approached the far end of the chamber. 5 pods grouped together caught my eye. Unlike the others, their lights flickered faintly, in an irregular rhythm that didn't match the smooth pulse of the others. I checked the manifest on my tablet. Jacob Elson, Christopher Barrett, Quentin Harcourt, Wyatt Klein, Isaac Cordell. The names were there, just as they'd been in Vigil's records, but something about these pods felt off, like they didn't quite belong. I moved closer and wiped a thin layer of condensation from the glass of the nearest pod. It was empty. All 5 of them were. The interiors were pristine, the cushioning still slightly indented from where bodies had once lain, but now they were nothing more than hollow shells. Footsteps behind me broke my focus. Dr. Alexander Mills stood a few feet away, his expression calm but curious. "You're jumpy," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Not like you, Brandon." "Not much about this rotation feels normal," I replied, rising to my feet. "What are you doing here?" "Checking vitals," he said, gesturing to the pods around us. "Part of my rounds." I studied him for a moment. Alexander was the ship's psychologist, and normally his calm demeanor was an anchor in situations like this. But today his usual ease felt thin, like he was trying too hard to play the part. "And the guests?" I asked, nodding toward the 5 flickering pods. "Have you talked to them?" Alexander crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the wall. "I have. They're interesting. A little odd maybe, but not hostile." "Odd doesn't cover it," I said. "They're showing up in places they shouldn't be, tampering with systems, and their records don't add up. None of it makes sense." "Does anything about this mission make sense anymore?" He countered, his tone mild. "We're flying through deep space with 10,000 frozen souls, hoping to make a home on a planet we've never seen. Maybe the guests are just another wrinkle in the chaos." "They're more than a wrinkle," I said firmly. "They're dangerous, and if we don't figure out what they're doing here, this ship is going to fall apart." Alexander stared at me for a moment, then sighed. "I'll keep an eye on them," he said. "But don't lose your head over this, Brandon. Paranoia won't help anyone." This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition, the gut-deep instinct that had kept me alive during my years as an aerospace engineer and later as an officer. Something was wrong, and I wasn't going to ignore it. Later that evening, the alert came through the comm while I was in the mess hall with Brandon. One of the cryopods in the Colonist bay had gone offline. By the time we reached the chamber, the pod was open. The colonist inside was missing. No body, no sign of malfunction, just an empty pod and a blinking red light on the console. Brandon's jaw tightened as he paced the floor, his boots clanging against the metal grates. Tyler knelt by the pod, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his tablet as he reviewed the system logs. I stood nearby, my eyes fixed on the empty chamber inside the pod. The sight of it stirred something deep and visceral, a blend of unease and anger I couldn't shake. "This isn't possible," Tyler muttered, shaking his head. "The pods don't just open. They're sealed into the life support system, locked until arrival." "Unless someone bypassed the system," I said. "Someone who knows exactly how to manipulate the ship." Tyler didn't reply, instead scrolling through the data. Brandon stopped pacing and turned to me. "You think it's them?" he asked flatly, crossing his arms. "I know it is," I said. The words felt heavier as I spoke them aloud, solidifying the suspicion that had been clawing at me since the first time I saw the guests. "Who else could it be? They've been moving through restricted areas, showing up where they shouldn't, and now this." "They couldn't have gotten in here without being noticed," Brandon shot back, though there was less conviction in his tone now. "Security locks are in place, unless they're better at this than we think," I finished for him. I looked toward the pod again, its open hatch like a gaping wound in the otherwise orderly rows. "Or unless they're not bound by the same rules we are." Brandon's lips pressed into a thin line and he looked away, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "So, what's the plan, Vickers? You want to round them up and interrogate them?" "No, not yet. We need proof first. Something concrete." Brandon snorted, his arms still crossed. "Proof isn't going to matter if they decide to open more pods. Or worse." He was right, and we both knew it. Tyler's presence at the console offered a sense of balance, his nervous energy tempered by his focus on the task at hand. But Brandon's frustration mirrored my own. Every moment we hesitated felt like another step closer to disaster. "We need to find the missing colonist," I said, standing straighter. "If we can figure out what happened to him, we might get the answers we need." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "You think he's still alive?" "I don't know, but it's the only lead we've got." Tyler looked up from his console. "I can try to track his life signs," he said. "Even if he's not with us anymore, the Ark's biometric systems might have a record of where he was taken." "Good," I said, nodding. "Get on it." An hour later, Tyler's findings led us to an area of the ship we rarely used, an auxiliary research lab deep in the lower decks. The lab had been included in the Ark's original design for long-term scientific experiments, but with the crew on minimal rotation, it had remained dormant for years. The door was sealed when we arrived, but Tyler quickly bypassed the lock. When the door slid open, the stale, chemical-saturated air inside made me recoil. Tables lined the space, covered in equipment that hadn't been touched in decades, microscopes, containers, and diagnostic tools. In the center of the room, on one of the metal tables, lay the missing colonist. My stomach dropped. Brandon's muttered curse barely registered as I stepped closer, my boots scraping against the floor. The colonist was a man in his early 30s, his body stiff and pale. His suit had been torn open, exposing his chest and abdomen, where precise clinical incisions revealed layers of muscle and tissue. Tubes ran from his body to a nearby console which displayed an array of data in stark, glowing text. "What the hell?" Brandon's voice trailed off as he approached the body. Tyler stayed near the doorway, his face ashen. This is advanced," he stammered, gesturing to the setup. "Whoever did this, they knew exactly what they were looking for." I moved to the console, scanning the data. The readings didn't make sense. Neural activity patterns, metabolic rates, something that looked like genetic sequencing. It was as if the colonist had been reduced to a collection of variables to be analyzed and manipulated. "Looks like we've got our proof," Brandon said grimly. "Question is, what do we do about it? First, we confront them. If they're behind this, we need to know why, and what else they're planning." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Tyler looked less certain, his eyes darting between the body and the door. "And if they don't cooperate?" he asked. "Then we stop them," I said, my voice cold. "Whatever it takes." Finding the guests wasn't difficult. They were gathered in the observation lounge again, standing in a loose circle near the viewport. When we entered, they turned to face us, their movements perfectly synchronized. Salt and Pepper moved toward us, his expression calm. "Lieutenant Vickers," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "We found the colonist, the one who disappeared." For the first time, something crossed his face, an emotion too brief and too subtle to name. "I see," he said simply. "You killed him," Brandon growled, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "You cut him open like a damn lab rat." Salt and Pepper raised a hand in a gesture of placation. "Please understand, what we did was necessary." "Necessary," I snapped. "You dissected a human being. You tampered with the ship. You've been sabotaging us from the moment you woke up." "We did not sabotage. We observed and we studied. Your kind is fascinating, Lieutenant. Resilient, complex, but also fragile. We needed to understand." "Understand what?" "Survival," the wiry man said. "Your capacity for it. Your limits. We are not here to harm you, Lieutenant Vickers. We are here to learn." "Learn what?" I repeated. "Learn how to break us? How to control us?" Salt and Pepper shook his head. "No, we are here to prepare you. Your mission, this journey, it is filled with dangers you cannot comprehend. We are guides of a sort. But to guide, we must first understand." Brandon scoffed, his frustration boiling over. "Guides? You're butchers." The wiry man's gaze shifted to Brandon. "And yet you live. The Ark lives. Our work ensures that it will continue to do so." "That's not your decision to make," I said firmly. "This is our ship, our mission. You had no right." "No right," Salt and Pepper repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Perhaps, but rights are a human construct. We operate by necessity." "You're leaving," I said, my voice low but resolute. The guests exchanged glances. Salt and Pepper sighed softly. "If that is your wish." "It's not a wish," I said. "It's an order. You don't belong here." He nodded slowly, his demeanor unchanging. "Very well. But understand this, Lieutenant Vickers. Without our guidance, your journey will be far more perilous." "We'll take our chances," Brandon said coldly. The guests didn't argue. They simply moved towards the exit, their movements eerily smooth and coordinated. As they passed, Salt and Pepper paused, turning to look at me one last time. "Good luck, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "You will need it." The next morning they were simply gone. No sign of them remained, no trace in the logs, no evidence in the cryo bay. Tyler ran every diagnostic he could think of, but the results were always the same. It was as if the guests had never been there at all. The Ark felt different in their absence, quieter, heavier. The missing colonist was laid to rest in the observation lounge, his body preserved in stasis until we could give him a proper burial on Cythera. The crew carried on, but the unease lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. I sat in my quarters that night, staring out the viewport at the endless black. The guests had left us with more questions than answers, their motives as inscrutable as their actions. But one thing was clear: they had been watching us, testing us, and in some strange alien way preparing us for what I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out.